Go ahead and get started then. All right, so I've got my screen back up here. Let me know if you can't see it for any reason, but it looks like I'm sharing. So we're jumping into analytics now next. I'm probably going to move relatively quickly through this because I think most of the analytics side of things are pretty intuitive, but I will talk in more depth about data management and operational dashboards in particular, because I think those are both probably additional use cases that are maybe a little less intuitive. So the rest of our content is going to be sort of structured like this. We're going to look at sort of the high-level use cases here, and then dig into them, each one of them, in a little bit more detail. So pricing analysis, I think, is our easiest one. That is what dashboards are for. That's what Pricing Analyzer does. But there are a couple of nuances on the waterfall in particular. Pricing data visibility we'll spend a little time about. That's just really exposing data to the user from other places in the system in a single location. Really just it's more operational efficiency than anything. Data management is where things start to get a little bit more complicated. And this is really about providing a comprehensive user experience for users to be able to manage their data. And then operations management, which is sort of streamlining the way that users can work within the system. And then finally, custom published document generation, which to me is the most interesting case, but we'll get to that one towards the end here. So we're going to work off of a couple of user stories here as we progress. So if we use our Red Shoes Company example, our pricing director wants to do profitability leakage, right? They want to see where their discounts, the rebates, their freight charges, all of those things are impacting the profitability. They want to see the costs and how they impact profitability, and they want to see their rebate impacts. So some of the key items here, we're going to pretend this is an SAP system just to give a little bit of orientation to the data. In an SAP system, that ERP will normally have your discounts, freight charges, cost to serve elements, all of these things isolated out as price conditions. So in this case, we're saying we have those in price conditions. We have a price condition type that will let us easily identify what that is. So whether something's freight, whether something's cost to serve, or whether it's something else. And I'm really just using generic buckets here. Don't worry about the terms exactly, but we're just sort of looking at how we might manipulate this. So this side, this piece of things is relatively straightforward. When we get into product costs and rebates, it does get a little bit more complex. So probably one of the aspects that a lot of people have heard as a requirement is that they have maybe the bulk of their margin calculation data in ERP, but they have a number of other things that are external. Maybe like in this case, we're managing rebate impacts at the customer level and product type level, so not even down at the SKU level, but customer and product type on an Excel spreadsheet. That's the only place that data exists. That's the only way to look at it. It's not in the ERP at all. Our product costs, for example, may not be in our price conditions, but we have the costs and we know our historic costs, and we can sort of identify what the cost was at any time in the transaction, but it's not in the ERP system. It's not already reflected against our transactions. And then showing an additional table with a list of customers with sales volumes that will filter the waterfall for the customer when clicked on. This is just this is a user experience thing. What the customer wants to see is a list of customers first, and then wants to be able to click on one of those customers and show a waterfall for it. So as we get into these things, we're going to talk a little bit more about these types of requirements. I'll probably click back to this slide a couple of times to show you how and where we're fulfilling those. But sort of the first thing we'll jump into is the analytics dashboards. Again, as we've talked about, Sales Insights is pretty well proven. Use that as much as you can. We've got that implemented for over 60 customers. It might be more since the last time I checked on those stats, but I know we had a run in 2020 and 2021 where we did at least 50 customer implementations, and every new customer, for the most part, gets Sales Insights unless there's some reason they can't provide us transaction data. We have seen a sharp reduction in complex dashboard requirements since then. There are still custom dashboard requirements, of course, because everybody's got a metric here or there that they really want to see. But this has really reduced the complexity that we've had to deal with around analytics, which is one of those things that looks simple on its face, but really is much more complicated than it seems in most cases. Customer requirements are usually very precise for custom analytics, so when these do come up, it should be sort of their responsibility to give you all the relevant data elements that you'll use, the specific calculations, chart types they want to use, and filters. So the chart types and the filters may be something you want to be consultative on. They don't necessarily know how to visualize the data because they either haven't looked at it before or somebody's looking at it on an Excel spreadsheet and are limited by whatever options they have in that space. Recommending some chart types or something like that might be useful based on what's available in Price/FX, but it's not necessarily your responsibility as the SA. Customers should generally have a good sense of how they want to visualize things and how they want to break down the data, how they want to aggregate the data, and what that metric needs to look like. Most of the time when we've seen these one-off customer like custom analytics, they've been very precise about what they want. There hasn't been a lot of discussion about how to do things or what needs to be done. So normally you'll get that. If the customer can't define a custom analytic very well, what we'll typically recommend is why don't you start with sales insights, see what that will fulfill for you, and then we can talk about the custom analytics later. And usually that either defers or gives the customer a better frame of reference for what they actually want. Some of the an alternate use case here, one that's extremely complex, is scenario modeling, and this is where we're sort of changing factors about prices and then trying to look at what the impacts can be. That can be extremely simple in that you say, I want to take my prices up 5%. What's the impact on my profitability? But most of the time it's not like that because that's a very simple scenario and usually something that can be done pretty easily outside of Price/FX. Most of the time they want to manipulate 3 or 4 factors by product group, customer group, different region, all that stuff. And that generally creates a very complex set of calculations that sometimes you even need to do analytic simulations for, or a number of other things. It's in theory an extremely useful use case, but it's one to watch out for on complexity if or when that comes up for you. Otherwise, the requirements gathering and the use cases for analytics, I think, are pretty straightforward. When we get to our question section and there's something that maybe I haven't addressed here, we can talk about it a little bit more, but I think most of the time it's pretty clear what needs to be accomplished with our pricing analytics, so to speak. Solutioning, again, is relatively straightforward. There's a couple of items I'll highlight here around standard charts versus high charts and embedded dashboards. And these are really getting to know these features more than anything else. High charts is a third-party charting API. If you Google high charts, you'll find a whole bunch of information out there about it. There's test consoles, there's documentation. It's all extremely well written. The one thing you'll want to keep in mind is we don't necessarily implement every feature of high charts. So just because something's out there on high charts doesn't mean we do it. We have some other documentation about how we use high charts, but maybe not to the level of what features we implement, which is something that we'll look at in the future. But you can, if you find something on high charts that has not been implemented in Price/FX that doesn't work, you can always reach out to us with a product request, and that's going to be easier to add in a high charts feature rather than maybe building something from scratch. The key component of high charts is you have to query all that data in advance and pass it in as parameter to the chart configuration. So this is building your data set and then preparing it for the data series input that the chart API needs. It's highly customizable because of that, because you can do just about everything. You can sort of churn your data or calculate your data in whatever way you want to, and then feed it into the chart. But most of that work is going to have to be done in Groovy Logic before you send it into the chart API. So you'll want to present the chart API with exactly the data that it needs to produce. And in order to do that, you may have to do some calculations beforehand. It's highly customizable. You've got a lot of options out there. Like I said, we don't implement everything, but we do implement most of the very commonly used stuff. And then this is really ideal for usage in dashboards with advanced and complex charts with intensive calculations. So you can sort of manipulate that data in whatever way you want, and then you feed it to the chart, and you get a very tailored output. Standard charts are a little bit different. These operate against a data mart with filters. So you really need the data to already be prepared and be available, and all you're doing is aggregating it, filtering it, and taking in data that already exists in the data mart, and then feeding it into that charts, essentially implementation. Excuse me. So essentially, the configuration or the properties object for these charts is usually just a data mart and some filters. There may be a few other small items that you can set on there, like auxiliary lines or whatever. But the implementation is very simple, but it's also quick. So it runs the query at render time, which means if you have a lot of charts in a certain context, and we'll talk about inline analytics later, or you have, let's say, a dynamic dashboard in a certain place, where using the embedded dashboards function, standard charts are usually going to be more a better fit for those types of scenarios, because you don't have to have pulled all that data. Probably the most glaring use case here is if you have a quote with 200 line items and each one has its own chart. You're certainly not going to be able to sort of slice and dice and calculate that data for all 200 items and then feed it to 200 high charts. That's where standard charts really shine. You set some filters on the customer, products, whatever, and then you let the chart do the work when the user accesses it rather than in advance of that view. The embedded dashboards, I don't know how many folks have worked with these. I think they're a pretty well documented concept, but this is essentially where you can pop up a result matrix with a set of metrics, and then when you click on one of those, the other charts on the dashboard will respond to that click. So it can be a product, it can be a customer, it can be whatever you want, and basically the parameters that you have on that clicked row are fed down into the other charts, and then that essentially runs a refresh on those, very similar to like a configurator concept for those that are responsible for it. So you get some level of responsiveness, and you get almost like a drill down capability out of that that's really useful. It adds a nice sort of visual to our some of our dashboards, and gives the user sort of a good feel and the ability to granularize data in a certain way. So that embedded dashboards functionality is sort of what we're looking at here, on this last item where we're showing a table with a list of customers and sales volume. As I mentioned earlier, we don't have reference implementations today, so the demos I'm going to go through are more generic demo effects functionality. So it's not going to meet this story exactly, but I will explain sort of where it does and where it does not, and how it might look if we were to meet this exact scenario. So waterfalls. So this is a whole discussion in its own. A lot of the folks on this call I know have worked on waterfalls, and I know have struggled in certain places with waterfalls because the logic here can get there's a potential for infinite complexity depending on what level of data quality the customer has, and also how they want to allocate that data to their transactions. So the majority of the time, this is oriented around transaction data, and what we normally have on transaction data is how much the customer was charged for a product and how much of it that they ordered, but not often all of the other things that impact our profitability on the waterfall. So typically, we have to build a data load process, a calculation data load, in order to enrich that transaction data with the rest of the profitability information that we need. As I mentioned, systems like SAP have that information there, but it's not flat. And what I mean by that basically is you have one row that's a freight charge, you have one row that's a discount, and each one of those rows has an amount, when what we need for a waterfall chart is one column with freight charges and one column for discounts and so on. And so most of the time what we have to do is take that information either from the existing transaction data or maybe from another source and sort of allocate it out to the transactions based on some criteria, right? Product, customer, dates, that kind of thing. And that enrichment is something that can be extremely complex or it can be extremely simple. In the most sort of simplistic SAP use cases, it's really just a matter of looking at a condition data and then putting, a condition type, and then putting the amount in the right bucket, in the right column, either in a data source or in a data mart, and running the chart against it. Where we run into trouble is where customer data orientation does not match our transaction data orientation, right? Where something is not SKU-based or customer-based or transaction line item-based, and they have, let's say, as we mentioned up here, that rebate data that is maybe at the customer product type level. That's where they track it. They don't know for any specific customer how much of a rebate they got on any one SKU. So you're looking at this sort of broad data, and the requirement from the customer is usually to spread that out across all products for that customer, right? So if we have, for the month of June, a customer that received $1,000 in rebates on our Red Boots product type, we need to go across all that customer's transactions for Red Boots and spread that $1,000 out across the entire thing. So this is a situation where, yes, it can be done, but you really have to control the level of complexity. So this particular item is our only item like that, so it's probably okay. It's not going to be easy, certainly, but it is something that, Groovy Code and PriceFX are very capable of doing. You just need the customer to tell you how to assign those amounts to any given thing, right? Is it by quantity? Is it by total revenue? And again, simpler is better. Or is it just, do you want to put a blanket amount on every single transaction line item of that type, like that's truly key to just the number of transactions or something like that? Those are the things you'll really want to establish when working with this waterfall use case. And this is a place where it certainly makes sense to push back in some situations, right? And again, getting down to cost-benefit analysis, if there is a scenario where the profitability impact is going to be relatively low, but the data complexity is very high, that might be where you say, okay, we can do this, but it's going to be significantly higher in scope than we thought it would be. Or this is something that when you're scoping projects, maybe you dig into in a little bit more detail and ask what the quality of their waterfall data is, ask what they want to measure, and figure out what level of complexity you're going to get and build that in. And then make sure when you're presenting these estimates to the customers that they understand that the waterfall, because of the data quality or because of data orientation, might be disproportionately high in comparison to what you might want to do in other projects. So keep that in mind, especially on the waterfall when you're working with customers. However, once you get that data properly aligned, the charting is pretty straightforward, right? Waterfall charts, all they do is go and look at a specific column. They show the total from that column either as a increase or a decrease, and then you sort of show the cascading effect down to profitability or a number of profitability metrics. The filters and all of that you apply to the invoice transaction data, and that's pretty simple. Sometimes there's a percent basis versus a raw dollar, raw money numbers, but that's also relatively straightforward. Another alternative here would be to categorize that data at query time. I have never wanted to try this, it is something you could potentially do. I know it has been done, but it really only works in the simplest cases. If for some reason you can't or don't want to create a data load, if you have the right indicators on the transaction data of what each impact is, you can sort of go and look at that data and then render it and sort of build it at the time when you query for the dashboard. It's going to be far less efficient. It only works on the simplest use cases, and it relies on a certain structure of data. So it's potentially something to consider if you need to knock out a waterfall faster. I'm of the opinion, though, that this creates more complexity than it's worth, because now you have your dashboard or your chart creation and your sort of data categorization process in the same place. And I think separating the two of those, the categorization into the data load and the charting into the dashboard, is just a lot easier to work with. And also, this is not how Sales Insights works. So the Sales Insights waterfall, you need to have this data bucketed properly so that the chart can render it. So I'm going to go through a quick example here of a waterfall. And we're going to look at our DemoFX price waterfall. So we're not going to spend too much time on this because I think it's straightforward, but I do want to highlight a few items. This is the Sales Insights waterfall here. Comes with a bunch of default filters and selectors. You can choose your date ranges, your waterfall model, right? Do you want a percentage? Do you want it per unit? Do you want an absolute or numbers? Absolute basically means the total currency value. You've got your currency. All Sales Insights dashboard has this sort of advanced filter concept where anything that's not showing up there in your sort of quote unquote quick filters is just right here. So you can still use anything that's in the data mart by using this general filter. So here we have all of our discounts. You can see we can drill into some of these and look at the discounts a little bit more, and then go back to the high level. Anything with a link here is set up that way. The Sales Insights Accelerator will sort of guide you on these subcategorizations of things and how to set them up. But otherwise, the waterfall is just simply reading from this data mart. This data mart is our DemoFX instance, so it's not going to look the same way that it would in a more common implementation. You can see we do have all of our waterfall elements here. In this case, they're owned by our transaction data. Most of what you're going to see, though, is you're either going to want to enrich this directly on the data source if you have everything that you need in order to do that enrichment, or on the data mart. You can do a calculation data load to each. What I will say is that if you enrich to the data source, you get the native currency conversion capabilities of the data mart, and you don't have to worry about currency conversions. So keep that in mind. If you can enrich to the data source, basically augment the data source. So take this standard transaction data source and add all of our waterfall buckets as columns. So what you see here, segment margin advantage, adjustment costs, packaging adjustments. Enrich that to the data source if you can, and then let the data mart pick it up from that data source. So you'll have a similar structure to what you see here. But in some cases, you may have to create custom columns on the data mart, which I don't have an example of on DemoFX right now, but you can enrich to the data mart instead. Like I said, that is the more complex situation, but if your categorization, your waterfall bucket categorization, relies on data that's not in your transaction data source, you may need to enrich it to the data mart. So that's maybe another conversation to have with the customer about what they can provide on the transaction data versus what they might provide on another table that gets joined to it in the data mart. Okay, so moving on here. Pricing data visibility. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I've got a few examples down here. But when I talk about pricing data visibility, what I'm doing is really talking about aggregating data and making it visible on a dashboard from multiple places. So this could be something like you want to see all the prices for a customer. That might include some quote prices, it may include some contract prices, it may include some LPG prices, but you don't want to go to all three of those documents. You want one customer pricing visibility dashboard that picks up data from all of those places based on this customer filter, which of course you have to have the data to be able to sort that out within each of those document types. But essentially it's just sort of giving you one place to go and look at that data rather than having to look at it in multiple places. This is very much a user experience thing and very much an operational efficiency thing, in that you're going to get this kind of request from users really mostly oriented around I have a user that needs to see all of this. What can you do to make that work? And basically, if the data is somewhere in the system, you can go grab it and you can pull it in. You will want to keep an eye on performance. Sometimes it's good to pre-calculate this data, meaning to aggregate it in a single data source. So that's the only thing you have to query against, rather than going out to an LPG, a quote, and a contract or set of those at any given time. You can sort of use a calculation data load, as I mentioned, and aggregate that data, almost like the staging, export staging concept we talked about earlier. Aggregate that all in one place and have it sort of refreshed every 15 minutes or something like that, so the data is near real time. One of the things that we get a lot of requests for are limiting who can see what data. Typically, we'll use parameter tables. I'm going to refer to these as parameter tables, but when I say parameter tables, I'm referring to price parameters in the sort of old nomenclature. Now we refer to them as company parameters, and you'll see them I'll show in a second. You'll see them in a different spot in the menu in Godfather. But basically, you can use these parameter tables to sort of govern who can see what. The dimensionality is the biggest factor here, right? Do you set it up as user groups? Do you set it up as individual users? Is it based on a certain dashboard? Is it based on product groups? Is it based on SKUs? That can change the complexity of this data, but that's typically how we'll handle that kind of requirement. We'll have a table that an administrator can maintain that shows who gets access to what kind of data. So the sort of some of the example use cases here that you might want to think about, visibility to prices across multiple LPGs. So I mentioned this earlier, but if a customer, if one of our customers has 30 LPGs, but they have sales super users or pricing directors that need to go in and look at certain subsets of prices all in one place. Let's say they're LPGs are oriented around distribution centers or about regions. This could aggregate all of those views into a single place, and they can see maybe filter by region, group by region, whatever, and they can get better visibility there rather than having to go and look for this data in multiple places. Viewing price and cost changes over time, for example, is another one. And maybe we restrict sales users to only see price changes and not cost changes or something, right? So a certain metric rather than a certain filter being accessible to somebody, the metric is accessible, and that's something you'd maybe build in as a user group, saying user group sales users does not get presented with this additional line on the chart that shows cost over time. And then one thing that I've done recently for a customer is show errors from product cost calculations. So essentially what we'll do is when they run their recosting on PriceFX, which is basically just looking at ingredient costs and then their bill of materials and combining the two, if something's missing, maybe they don't have certain costs, maybe one of their bill of materials doesn't meet 100% criteria or something like that, we throw all those errors into a price parameter table, and then the users can look at them in a dashboard and filter based on certain product groups. Maybe our red dress shoes group wants to see all the errors that they've had from their costing calculations. They'll filter by red dress shoes products that have failed in the recosting process, and they'll be able to see all of that in one place and have like proper visibility to it. So another example here is around data maintenance. So in this particular example, we are talking about creating and maintaining custom price list configuration. So this is going to fall into our next requirement also around how to actually generate those custom price lists. In this case, we have a customer that has a requirement where they want to do customer-specific price lists that are, and they want the products that are attributed to any given customer to be maintained by their customer service group. So essentially, they can create a customized price list for any customer based on products they're interested in, products they buy, certain product groups, whatever it happens to be. They want this information to be visible to the users. So they want to be able to have users be able to come in and see what products are allocated to that customer. Maybe there's a private label group in here where Red Shoes manufactures certain brands for Walmart or Target. I guess Target would be a better example since their color is red, but they want Target branded shoes that are all red. And so we have a situation where that customer has a certain subset of products that they will always buy consistently, and we want to send them a price list just for those. And then sort of the maintenance around this is users being able to add or remove products for a selected customer, so manipulating that data. And then in this case, our Red Shoes company is very concerned about the order in which those products appear on these price lists. They want to show maybe the highest margin products at the top of the list rather than later in the list. So this is a good use case for what we refer to as our configuration wizards. So our configuration wizards are like dashboards, but our inputs sort of take center stage on those instead of outputs, which is what you get normally with a dashboard. You can sort of manage data. Think of this as really a user interface for managing data. All that data still needs to exist somewhere in PriceFX, whether it's in parameter tables, extension tables, whatever it happens to be. They will be able to sort of manipulate that data, work with that data, but you'll give them a nice clean UI in order to do that. They'll have inputs and be able to sort of click a button and update those tables in a coordinated manner rather than sort of just going directly into a table and making modifications. This provides value because you can do field level validations. You can restrict the values that can be done. You can calculate a value before you put it in a table, for example, or you can update multiple tables with a single click rather than having to go into 3 or 4 different tables and sort of maintain that referential integrity. I would say think of it like creating a custom web app that's got CRUD functionality. This is one of the items that's probably underused in PriceFX, but also has the potential to create a lot of complexity depending on how intricate they want this to be. What you're going to want to do when you talk about these types of features, data management features with the customer, is sort of ask them around these things. What format does the user need to enter? Right? Sometimes you might need to enter a date here and then have that attached to a price or something like that. You might need to present the user with a table or an input matrix in this case to make updates, add rows, that kind of thing. What kind of operations do you need? So coming back to the CRUD functionality, do you need to delete, update, alter, and then what's the value add? And this is more of a question for the solution architect. What's the value add of the dashboard versus direct interaction of the tables, right? How much is it going to help to create a configuration wizard around this versus to have users work directly in the tables? So we have plenty of customers where users are working directly in the tables, and we have a few customers that are using configuration wizards. So these are great when you need them, but if you can avoid needing custom UIs because you're not adding any value through the custom UI, that's always going to be easier to handle on a project implementation. And then you can use this to alter and update data sources which would otherwise be read-only. This is a more complex use case for things, so I would say try to avoid these, right? Update master tables and then use the templates feature to replicate into data sources. But if for some reason, and I can't think of one right now, you really need to directly maintain data sources, there's a ways to do that here. So from a solutioning approach, you can use dashboards for this, right? Dashboards, like I said, don't really make the inputs the star of the show. You're going to have all your inputs off on that left-hand panel, and then you're going to have a big empty area in the middle where your charts or your tables would be otherwise. If charts or tables support the activity that's being supported here, then you can always throw those in there. Often what we do before configuration wizards existed is we would have a pop-up configurator where users could make changes, and we could present an input matrix, we could present different inputs, stuff like that, and then the main table would be a result matrix that just sort of showed the user what they've just done, right? Or showed them the existing table that they're updating. So it still gives pretty good visual feedback, but it's not quite as nice or quite as like input focused as a configuration wizard would be. You can create sets of inputs using different portlets or configurators for responsive functionality. So basically anything you could do, if you think about this like a differently formatted quote almost, right? You're creating a form for the customer. You can use the same types of functionality that you would be able to for a quote, but you're putting it in a more dashboard-like implementation. There also are workflow steps, sort of informal workflow steps that you could use with configuration wizards that I'll show here in a demo in a second. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, data validations, referential integrity management, calculated elements, that kind of stuff can all be managed. This is one of the few times I'll really talk about code here, but this primarily uses like our add or update or delete methods to make adjustments. You'll tie those to buttons, and then whatever the user's entered, you'll sort of grab that information and then update a table where you maintain this data elsewhere. A lot of folks need to use bound calls in some cases, especially for mass data updates. I don't think that's a real big problem with configuration wizards because you're usually not doing 1,000 rows at a time on a configuration wizard. This is sort of line by line user interaction most of the time. So these API methods are sufficient. But we do have a product feature that's in the works right now to sort of make those to make mass update capable through API.methods instead of having to use bound calls. Bound calls are generally something that we try to recommend against, but knowing full well that that's the only solution for certain things, and granted it's more complex things, but that's the only solution available for certain things. Operational dashboards are sort of an offshoot of this. This is really being able to provide the customer with a one-stop shop for whatever they happen to have to do on that day. So this falls distinctly into that category of making operational users' lives easier. This is another thing. This is lower complexity than data management usually, because most of the time you're just sort of linking out to things. It can get complex if you're talking about things like generating price effects pricing artifacts, right? So we have a few situations where building quotes just wasn't palatable to customers for some reason. And so we gave them a dashboard that allowed them to build quotes. It really just simplified the quote building process. They would maybe pick a customer. It would automatically import all the products that they would order. They'd set a couple of prices, click a button, and that creates the quote for them. And so that kind of thing can be done also. That also, of course, is much more complex than maybe something simple where you get a result matrix with a bunch of steps on it, and you can link out to the relevant artifacts. So it's something to keep in mind around complexity again, and that's obviously becoming a trend here. But you can sort of provide a better user experience in how to do things in price effects. It's less for the customer to remember, potentially less for you to document, less for you to train them on, if they have sort of this streamlined approach to how they execute their daily work. So we'll do another quick example here. So what I'm going to show are basically the configuration wizards that our accelerators use, because I think there's a lot of good examples in this. So I'm going to start here. If we look at our company processes, so I mentioned this earlier, our company processes sort of show all of our configuration wizards, and we've got a number of different items in here. Our workflow This workflow accelerator is one that I was talking about earlier that lets you sort of click through. You can see we selected we want to alter our price list workflow. Then we go to the next step, and our next step is adding rows, basically adding approval conditions on here. And then once we're done with that, we move on to our approvers, and we can make an adjustment there. So you can see it's sort of giving you the ability to work through almost a step-by-step data management workflow. I won't necessarily call it a true workflow because really we're just creating stages for the update of multiple tables. But one input may drive the next, and so you can sort of give the user a bit of an orchestrated approach for this. Sort of the simplest view we have here is this default filter wizard. So this sets default filters for our sales insights dashboards. We can set those on a dashboard basis. If we look at our, let's say, our comparison waterfall, it shows us a bunch of inputs here, and these are the inputs you have on the dashboard itself. I can go in here and I can select some of these, and then when I hit apply, it's going to store these parameters for me so that every time I load those dashboards, it's pulling in these default settings and giving us that information to start with. So if I hit apply, and then, as I mentioned, the price parameters have moved. They are now called company parameters. They're up here in this little switches item. And if I look here and I look for the default filters, I'll see that this is essentially just created a row on this table, right? It's keyed to me. This particular one, since it's not a user readable, it's not something that needs to be user readable. It's storing this in JSON, right? But this is a way to sort of manipulate our data, but make it more easily guided approach. Obviously, no user is going to come in here and write JSON directly into this field. And granted, you wouldn't necessarily need to do that, right? You could have multiple rows, one per filter, and then a value in there. But even that is a little bit tedious for a user to have to come in here and set 6 different values in a table. So instead, they can simply use this configuration wizard, and that gives them the ability to do that in a much simpler way. Another good example here and shows the flexibility and the power of this is if we look at the price setting accelerator wizard, you can see we have just a big HTML readout here, right? This is telling us the selections that we've already made for this accelerator and telling us what's been checked, what's not. And this is just using a basic HTML table. So you can set up basically an HTML portlet with that readout. You can add this input on it. This will ask us what we want to make modifications to. We're going to change our net pricing, go to configure module, and you can turn it on, turn it off. This is this view is very simple, and what we're changing here is very simple, but the capability of the feature gives you a lot of options because you can use just about anything if you're using HTML and sort of feed that information in here and then provide a number of inputs, other things that you click out to, in a step-by-step approach. Each one of these screens is basically a single element in the logic, and so all we're doing is effectively creating dashboard portlets and then inputs on top of those portlets. The main part of the portlet is just using HTML and working with it that way. So it gives you a ton of flexibility. Obviously, with flexibility comes complexity, and so you do have to be careful on how detailed you get and how you set these up for users. So jumping back in, we've got another example here. So we're going to talk a little bit more. So we talked about the creation of the data for these price lists before, and essentially what we're going to do is provide the user with a configuration wizard that lets them select a customer as an input, show a product list, right? That will probably store in a table of some kind. Maybe it's a customer extension, maybe it's a product extension. Doesn't really matter where you store it or how you store it, as long as you understand how to interact with it. And then our customers basically, users basically should be able to set up that data for the customer and maintain a table again, they could go directly to the table if you wanted, and this is an intentionally simple use case. They could just go directly to the table and make alterations, and I have a use case exactly like this where the users do go directly to the table, or they use the Excel client or something to upload data. But this example, for the purposes of this, right, the sequencing here aspect is probably the most unique in that that's where a calculation would come in, where you might need to assist the user with that. If a user has to go in and maintain sequencing on a table that's got thousands of rows on it, they're going to mess something up, and that's going to break whatever the next the function that uses this is. So it's something to keep in mind in terms of where it's adding value, right? To the point about adding value, is there a place that adds value? If you took this last item off of here, there's no reason why users couldn't work directly off the table. So if we look at this, now what we're getting down to is actually publishing those price lists. So this is where it can be complex. So the idea behind this is they want to publish these customer-specific price lists. They've given us lists of products already, and they've attached them to a customer. Now we need to go harvest the rest of the data for that from the right places, pull it together, and then show it to the user so that they know that they can publish that price list. So this is a very common requirement, but one that doesn't always necessarily have a direct case. I think everybody knows there's publishing templates that are attached to quoting, to LPGs and stuff like that, but your artifacts, your quotes, your LPGs, your price lists aren't always oriented around the context that you need to do exports for, right? So your list prices are not customer specific. Quotes may only give you a certain subset of products that you need to publish to a customer. So this is where we use almost a version of an operational dashboard or a data management dashboard to handle this. What we're going to do in this case is essentially from a requirements perspective, we just need to understand what the customer wants to accomplish, right? Where are all the prices that we need to pull in? What kind of documents do you want? How do you need to manage the data behind it? What operations do you need to do? Is this something that you need to generate directly to a user's desktop to email to somebody, or is it something that you need to auto-generate and pull onto SharePoint or a drive or something like that somewhere? One of the things that has come up before is auto emailing of pricing documents out of PriceFX to our customers. We usually strongly recommend against that because PriceFX is not really a CRM system, so we don't want to interact directly with customers. Pricing is intentionally supposed to be sort of behind the curtain. So what we recommend is that these documents are generated either by a user to their desktop and moved somewhere to send out, or manually sent out, or there's a sort of an API call to pull the document off of the system and then send it from somewhere else. So strongly recommend against, in my opinion, direct emails from PriceFX to customers. The upside of this sort of feature, though, getting back on track here, is it allows for visualization and confirmation of final pricing numbers before you generate the document. So if you have a situation where you need to add a freight charge, you need to add a discount, or whatever to this customer, but those aren't in the list price, for example. Maybe you have that in your contract data, and you need to pull that out and consolidate it from somewhere else, right? You should be able to do that in your, not contract, agreements and promotions is the terminology now, but in what was Promotion Manager. Most of the time you can do that in that agreement or promotion document, but there may be situations where you need to sort of aggregate some price calculations in one place because they don't exist somewhere else, or maybe you haven't even implemented agreements and promotions, but they do want to apply discounts for certain customers on their price lists. So you can sort of generate this document if you have the right information available in the system, and sort of create a custom published document based on whatever factors you can store in this underlying data. So from a solutioning approach, this is, like I said, this is a very common use case. It still requires the creation and utilization of an Excel or Word publishing template. So you still need to have that there. Data enrichments and calculations can sort of be incorporated into the dashboard logic. outside of the actual publication of these things, it's just a normal dashboard use case. So what does the customer want to see and what does the customer want to publish? Usually it's the same thing. So you're giving them a result matrix, and that's exactly what they're going to get in their publishing template, basically, in most cases, right? So you're using the dashboard to harvest the data, make it available to the public publishing template, and then really all you're doing, if you look at this very last line, is we're adding a, and this is where we're going to say bound call, because this is the only option. We're adding a bound call API call out to this formula manager.execute formula API, where we're executing a certain logic from the dashboard. And this logic is basically going to aggregate all the data that we need to feed to our publishing template. And then we're saying we have output type of PDF, that can be Excel instead. And then our template name, which is our Word template that's used to generate that PDF. So we have 3 parameters we're passing into this API call: the logic name, the output format, and the template itself. And that's going to basically give us a document. So what it's saying is execute this logic with this output type using this template, and all it's going to do is take that logic, run it on the system, gather up whatever data needs to be gathered up, and then sort of stuff it into that publishing template, and then generate a PDF document for it. So this is extremely flexible, extremely useful. It gives you the ability to reorient how prices can be published away from just the pricing artifacts like the LPGs or the quotes or the agreements and promotions, and gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of how customers can deliver that. Again, this is something that comes up very frequently, and there are other ways to accomplish this, right? You can use quotes as a product list for a customer. To me, this is when you have something where you just need a published document and nobody needs like direct visibility to some of the other data elements. You can take this approach, and it's going to look just like our configuration wizards, just like a dashboard, but then we'll have this extra bound call on there. And you can take this approach and sort of give the users a lot of flexibility. So I didn't have a question break set up here, but maybe I will stop really quick for a couple of minutes before we get into price setting and check to see if there's any other questions. We've got about an hour and 15 minutes left, it looks like. I think that should be enough to get through the rest of the content on price setting and quoting. But I'll stop here, see if there's any questions on analytics.
Yes. Again, this is Surya. I saw that you are having a dashboard and you can set up filters outside like a configuration wizard.
Mm-hmm.
So can we call this dashboard from other modules with a link, auto-populated these filters? Like I'm having a quote,
Sure.
and in the quote I'm in a line item.
Yep.
So it should. I'm not asking to show the dashboard there. I'm not sure if the new feature it is there or not, but
yep.
If I click a link, it should open the dashboard, pre-configured dashboard with the customer, and the line it is there, it should pick all the parameters and it should
Yep.
pass and show the dashboard.
Sure. Yeah, so we can do that, and it actually looks very similar to this execute formula call. Instead, we're linking, and then we're putting our input arguments. So basically, in the URL for the dashboard, you'll have the question mark, and then you'll have the input name, so the filter name, and then the value, filter name value, and so on. And essentially, there's you can create a custom link to a pre-filtered version of that dashboard, and you can put that link in various spots. I know result matrices allow it. I'm pretty sure you can do that in an LPG. And then when we talk about quotes, there's actually an embedded dashboard feature that we'll talk about later where you can actually put a dashboard directly in the quote that might fulfill that for that aspect for you also. I'll take a quick note here on making sure that that might already be in the knowledge base, but I'll take a quick note to make sure.
Actually, I have
accounted for.
Actually, I have a more user other case for this. Like
Okay.
You have integration with the Salesforce. Most of the time they will ask, okay, I have this price
Sure.
FX integration and I have a dashboard there. I'm in Salesforce quote or some proposal. Can I see what this customer looks like from the analytics dashboard? So what all the need is the dashboard. They don't want to send it the quote here and then what they're doing is just analytics. So if we have this custom dashboard where we can dynamically pass the parameters, probably we can call from the one of the link directly shows up on the Salesforce or other CRM tools.
Yeah, the Salesforce integration might require another step just to make sure that something you click in Salesforce syncs back to PriceFX properly from an authorization standpoint, but the link concept should be the same regardless.
So still means if we are interacting with the customer, if they ask this feature, we can commit them, this feature is available.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. That's first question. And then you're talking, because we are completing the dashboard, you said currency conversion. Do you allow any limitation like one currency conversion or multiple currency conversions can maintain like a two customer says I'm having one business uses one currency conversion, another scenario, another currency conversion. Is there anything specific like that?
There's no limitations. So there's a native, and you may be familiar with this already. There's a native currency data source in here that maintains currency conversions based on time frames. So here's the rate, here's the valid to, valid from, here's the currency to and from. Anything you have in this table, really, you can use anywhere. It defaults for the data marts and it defaults for the price analyzer charts also, where you pick a currency. The thing that you need to do in your underlying data, though, is make sure you have the currency identified. And there's a currency context in here. Let's see. Let's find a transaction data source. So there is a currency field function. So you can see this first data type here is currency. That's going to match your codes together. And then whatever output currency you choose, it's going to go look for that conversion rate and then display in that currency.
Not specific. I know this, but I'm looking at like maintaining two currency, means same USD to Euro, Great Britain, but one department using one rate, another department using another rate.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't think we have that level of granularity in the default functionality. I think it depends primarily where you want to use it. So you could theoretically create your own
data source.
Yeah, exactly. Another data source for a different group and then query that one instead, I would say is probably your best bet. I would not tinker with this data source, of course, because this is used in native functionality. But yeah, I would say you maybe create a version of this data source that has your business unit or your region as another key in here, and then just start using that one for whatever the use case is.
Then one last question. This publishing PDFs, whatever the prices are there, can we confirm that we generated a price list for all the customers and with some parameters, one click of a button, if it can generate like 1,000, 2,000 different price lists, means customer specific, and put it in one place in the PriceFX so that they can bring into their system, they can export to the customers. Is that available? Or I hear you're saying it is available, but just want to confirm.
Sort of, right? So it doesn't necessarily extract into a place in PriceFX. What you would have to do in order to make something like that work is make an individual API call like this, right? So this really is just an API endpoint. You would have to either use the integration manager or a customer system to make this API call, maybe 1,000 times with different parameters set up in it, and you can add parameters into this. So it's not ideal, right? Mass generating documents, I think, is something that we need to look at from the product side, and it's not a conversation we've had yet. It is theoretically possible. It's not pretty, though.
Okay. Because customers that I worked with, they always ask this. They want to have, our PDF generation is a lengthy process. You're generating prices. You should print these things. And if we say, you need to run a program calling multiple times, that exports takes 4 days, 5 days time to generate PDF, then most of the time they will not be happy. Okay, thank you. Right now it is a customizable solution, not out-of-box solution.
Correct. Yeah. And just like generally speaking, I think that use case isn't uncommon, and sort of the way we've solved it in the past is to generate the data and have the PDF conversion done elsewhere. So we'll generate a whole bunch of CSV files and then let the PDF conversion be done on the customer systems. That, of course, is not always possible, right? They don't always have a means to create and convert to PDFs. So it is, it's certainly a valuable use case and something we'll have to look into more from a true productization process standpoint.
Even though I said last question, this is the last question I'm having. Is there a way to undeploy an accelerator? Some click and undeploy.
That is a good question. That I don't know, and I don't know if I think Billy was planning to join today, and he might be the only person that could answer that. But that I'm not sure. I will look into that. It looks like Billy's not on, so undeploy accelerator. I'll double check on that. And it may already be, if it's possible, it's probably already on the knowledge base, but I have not looked at that section. But I'll check into that, and we'll provide some information